welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who, as a mercenary hired by the Hokuten, is not obliged to show respect to me.
Yeah, you jerk.
Is
that where
yep.
you want? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
okay. That's my line.
How about your name?
Tim Longo. Yes, that's me.
I'll try to fix that in post. Jeez, wow.
Disrespectful. No, leave it in. That's fine. That's all fine.
Okay, yeah, it's all good. It's all good. Well, there's probably a few people out there who know this series well enough or know this game well enough to recognize the Hokuten. Would not be a thing I would recognize, but we are starting a new series this week about Final Fantasy Tactics.
What? Another Final Fantasy game? I don't believe it. We said we would never play another Final. We would never do that.
Yeah, and next is Final Fantasy 12. That's the one we play after this, and then Vagrant Story.
No, we can't. If we ever play another JRPG, it's gonna have to be 7. People will riot. I mean.
There's a lot of 8 partisans out there.
Sure. I mean, I know there's fans of each one of them, including this one, and that's probably a big reason why I know this is kind of a very beloved kind of cult classic in the Final Fantasy franchise. But I don't know. Like we played 6 and 9 and not 7.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's the one that's getting a remake. So I don't know. It's just funny to me.
It's wild to me that they are remaking that. Yeah.
It's not your favorite, right?
No, 9's my favorite. That's the first one.
Yeah.
We played 9 first, because I was like, well, if we're going to play 1, we might as well play my favorite one. I had not at that point played 6, which I also think is quite great.
That's very good.
I've enjoyed most of them.
6 and 9 are very much siblings.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I feel like.
Yeah, they bear a lot of the same marks. But before we get to jumping into the game proper, let's set it a little bit as we do in its time. It came out in 1997, which is a year in which we have played 5 games I'm seeing here. One of them this year in The Last Express. We looked at the timeline that's on the Dev Game Club site. And I'm like, it looks like just the 4 games. And Tim's like, nope, The Last
Thanks,
Express.
Pockets.
Yep, thanks, Pockets, for sure. But the other ones were GoldenEye, which we played around this time last year, Diablo, Fallout, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is, man, what
wow. What's all good games. All those games? Holy cow.
Yep. That was quite a year for RPGs too.
I mean, and then 98 happens.
Yeah, and 98's the next year.
Right after this, It's just no wonder we all became game developers. Although we were already game developers.
Fair enough. I wasn't in 1997. I was playing some of these games. But we should talk about other games that came out this year for sure. The Final Fantasy VII being the other one. So if we do another 97 game, it might have to be that. But it might come from this list generally. I'm going to just rattle them all off because if I do them in the order I have them, it's easier to do the show notes. Curse of Monkey Island, the original Grand Theft Auto, Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, Myth, The Fallen Lords, Ultima Online, Outlaws, X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, Star Fox 64, Quake 2, that Blade Runner adventure game, Dungeon Keeper, Age of Empires, Riven, which I played streaming some years ago, Gran Turismo, and Interstate 76. Many interesting, good games in there that are probably worth playing. Dungeon Keeper is one that I know I've pushed for in the past, although we ended up playing Populous. And we've mentioned Myth several times. Whenever we talk about real-time strategy, we talk about Myth a little bit because we remember it fondly. And any other of those particularly stick out to you?
No, I mean it so places me in my own head in a place, because that was my early years, and so many good LucasArts games came out this year. But
One of
Dungeon
which you
Keeper,
tested.
yeah, and in fact, I mean, obviously the way QA often works is you bounce around a bit. I was mainly on X-Men versus TIE Fighter, but I did some testing on Outlaws and Curse of Monkey Island, and kind of they bounce you around because they want fresh eyes on things. But yeah, I played X-Men versus TIE Fighter too much. But Interstate 76 is the one that we kind of found on the list right before we started, and both of us, I think, had kind of like this, fond memories of that one. It's very.
I have fond memories of wanting to play it. That's one I've actually never played. So.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's super stylish, which is why I want to play it. It's like this
very interesting
70s
game
vibe. Yeah,
yeah, and it's coming from ex Mech Warrior developers.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's a really interesting lineage there as far as like how they got to that game. It's a very interesting and kind of weird game, but very cool. And I bet people listening, a lot of the hardcore people will know of it. But
oh, sure, yeah, it comes up sometimes on the Discord. Speaking of legacies, this game was largely staffed, at least at sort of the leadership levels, from people who had come from the Ogre Battle series, which was a series that started, I believe, on the SNES from a company called the Quest Corporation. It had games out in 93 and 95, and I think one had also finished, maybe hadn't quite come out yet, or maybe had just come out when this began development in 95. All of which the game's director worked on. So they kind of were like, boy, we'd really like to make one of those. It was executive produced by Hironobu Sakaguchi of Final Fantasy 6 and 9 fame, and Final Fantasy generally, of course. He really liked these style of games, and so he wanted to make one in the Final Fantasy universe and kind of put the Final Fantasy spin on it. And so that's kind of how that came to be. He got a team together who could do it. So it draws a lot from that lineage for sure.
Yeah, it was, I mean, again, as we've established so many times on the podcast, I was just such an outsider on JRPGs and Final Fantasy specifically, but remembering this year, this would have been my second year in the industry. I guess I would have, but in 97, I would have transitioned into design probably late 97 or something like that too. But there was a friend at LucasArts named Chris Hockabout who I remember just becoming obsessed with Final Fantasy VII and being a huge fan of it and a big proponent of it and kind of trying to get everyone in the office to play it. And then this came out, or I forget the exact order. Maybe I have that backwards, but I think that he played this one second, basically. And then gushing about this, and he was also very surprised, I think, at how good this one was because it was so different from Final Fantasy VII. And I know that Final Fantasy VII became, like an entry point for a lot of people for the series, especially if you had a PlayStation. So, or it was like the PlayStation game. But this one, I felt like was a dark horse, and it feels like it's always brought up, in the next breath after you start talking about Final Fantasy games of this era, because, I mean, my surprise at the time, the reason I bring up the Chris story is just because, when he was showing it to me and stuff, I just was surprised at the genre change being so drastic.
Right.
I guess it's still turn-based combat, so it's, there's definitely similarities, but the tactical aspect of it and the tile-based aspect of it, it just was very surprising to me at the time, and I hadn't known about the Ogre games, so yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot of similarities to tabletop role-playing combat with miniatures, which at the time were also having a bit of a resurgence, right? I mean, the third edition came out maybe a little later than this, but I can remember my own Chris story, not Chris Hockabout, but Chris Corey, with whom I shared an office at the time, when we got our PS2s at LucasArts. So this, would have been a few years after this came out. He recounted going to, I don't know, GameStop or something, and he was looking at picking up Final Fantasy Tactics, and he brought it to the counter. The kid manning the counter was like, "Oh, you're gonna hate that. It's like chess." And Chris is like, "Oh yeah, chess, famously a poorly known, game that nobody likes. You're gonna hate it. It's like chess, some, pimply, 15-year-old at the GameStop, who would, admittedly, it wasn't for him. But Chris was very much like, well, thank you very much. I will take that. I didn't know it was like chess. But now I'm intrigued.
Now I'm really excited. Yeah.
So it was, didn't exactly do. I don't think that kid was really fulfilling the mission of game stuff either. I don't think you're supposed
that was
to
also probably EB Games at the time.
It might have been. Yeah, it might have been.
That was that one
in
that mall that we all would go to. It was the only one we all went to.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah,
I don't remember which it was, but yeah,
it's and I think that's it. I mean, it's a funny story in that it's. I do think that this is a catch you off guard kind of Final Fantasy game, and I know it spawned a bunch of sequels and stuff, and it's still beloved. But I definitely starting it up, having not played it before, only watching over someone's shoulder a little bit. I mean, we played XCOM on the podcast. We've talked a lot about XCOM. I've streamed XCOM a little bit, and everyone that was my wheelhouse as far as tactical combat games, turn-based tactical combat games go. But because I wasn't into the franchise, it was sort of like, I don't know. It's not for me. But just jumping in, it's sort of, and I guess I didn't think about this until now. I'm playing Final Fantasy VI right now. So I'm kind of, my headspace is in there, but it's so jarring, I think, for me to, and kind of delightful in an unexpected way to have the sort of structure of the game be what it is.
Yeah.
And then go into these turn-based tactical moments, which even today, it's like you have the Mario Rabbids game, right?
Sure,
that does well and
the new XComs.
The new XComs, right? It's like, so this is
the Fire Emblems.
Fire Emblem, yeah, good point. Fire Emblems are
super popular.
Still huge, yeah. So clearly, modernizing these is still possible and popular and still going. So it's really fascinating, and it's really, and we'll get into it as we talk about it. But it's just really interesting to see translating, because XCOM was my foundation for this genre, translating it to a PS1, the decisions that they're making to achieve that goal. So we'll talk about it as we go. But I think that's going to be kind of a meta topic. Yeah,
for sure. One of the things I really appreciate about this over some of the PC titles that you've mentioned, the XCOM specifically, to mention one we played, is how close in it is. It's I know the maps get bigger, and I know that there are surprises and things like that happen in battles, but for the most part, you can pretty much see everything when you start. So it really is more like chess, in that everything.
That
about
kid was right
about the field when you start. I mean, you may not immediately know what all these characters can do, and I really should find a PDF of the manual and send to you, because there's a lot about the job system and stuff that we'll talk about
I have
next
it.
Week. Okay.
I have it on that version that I got on the PlayStation 3.
Oh, it's on the PS3. They have a manual for it. I didn't even.
On the sub menu. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
Or on the system menu, you can go and.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I didn't even look, but I will look. Thanks for mentioning that. I didn't know that. That's super useful. That'll save me time tracking it down.
And I mean, I haven't read it yet, but I think I'm going to have to, because there's definitely a lot of opacity that I'm like, because they have already mentioned that the Zodiac symbols have some relationship. So if I'm just kind of randomly equipping my team, and I probably could be doing that more efficiently.
That's probably true, although I will say anything about the Zodiac went entirely over my head the first time I played it, which was, over 2 decades ago on the, when we first got our PS2s. So I don't remember anything about it. I do remember a couple missions in particular where I was like, oh, that was really hard. I can remember a mission where I was like, man, I never thought I'd get past that one. I don't remember grinding, but I also might not have realized, because I played this kind of early in my JRPG career, I might not have realized that grinding was really a thing, especially for a game like this. I might have not done much of that, which I gather you can with this game.
How would you grind in this? I mean, I guess we'll find out, but can you go back to locations?
I assume there's random battles somewhere.
Oh,
because Final Fantasy in the overworld, right?
Yeah, well, it's still early, but yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that's my guess. You mentioned that from the some of the research you had done. that there was possibly some grinding, and I was like, I don't remember doing any of that. It's possible I did, and I just don't remember as well. It's
I got the time to beat, but the extra stuff, it implies that there's side missions or something that you can, or optional content maybe.
That also might be leveling up particular jobs as well that you don't. You might, if you wanted to get something of every job, like that would definitely take you a lot longer. So, but you would need there to be random battles in order to level those things. Because some things only become available after you've gotten levels in other jobs. That's one.
You mean like mission, like quests, the battles? You mean?
No, I mean random battles. You'd want random battles so that you could level and try different trees in the job system.
Got it.
Basically, tech trees for your characters, right? You can switch what the job is of the character. We'll get into that. We're not going to talk about that this week because I haven't read up on it again, and there are some real weird ones late in the game too. That there's one that works with calculation, like kills everything that has a level times 5. That's a multiple of 5. So I would stay away from that if I were you. I might do that, but you should not.
Well, I'm I only bring up the Zodiac stuff because I definitely tend to be a min-maxer if I can figure things out, and I like to really optimize, and so I have that anxiety's already kicking in where I did look at some of the tutorial, like the written tutorial, not the playable, early stuff. I didn't finish going through that, but they talk about it there where it's like certain characters of certain Zodiac symbols like other Zodiac symbols, and so if you put them together, then they will amplify each other somehow. So stuff like that. But you mentioned in pre-show that the Zodiac stuff is also related to Final Fantasy 12, which Mark Garcia has given me a copy that I
frequent mention here on the cast.
Not played, but apologize, Mark. But
you should. I mean, of the RPGs, that's an easy one to play modern because there's a time multiply function on the remaster. You can speed up the time, so all the running around is much faster.
Oh, well, I'm definitely enjoying the Final Fantasy VI stuff they did with that for making it faster.
Yep. Yeah, quality of life improvements there for sure. I mean, I would probably not play it that way, but that's because I'm weird.
Yeah.
And one of these days I am going to replay that because I did buy it for PlayStation 4 and have yet to even take it out of the case.
Which one?
Final Fantasy 12.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm excited because he got me a Switch copy, so I'm excited to play it. I love the Switch, so it'd be a perfect place to play it for me. So I just haven't had the time.
Yeah, there are other series too that in this kind of genre that are popular. I know that there's the I think it's called Disgaea series that started in the PS2 era. That is very popular. I know it's got at least 5 mainline installments. I happen to see Disgaea 5 on my PlayStation library. Not that I bought it. I have one of the subscriptions. I was like, I might take a look at that as well. That one I remember having the distinction where all of your weapons could be leveled up if you went into the item as a dungeon. The items were dungeons.
Oh, whoa.
Which is a very Anachronox, remember with the planet? It's a very Anachronox style weird thing. I think this guy has demons and things. It's a very weird kind of world. I've not played any of them, so I'm just kind of going off of random memories here. But it is another series that I've always been like, that is a series I should check out. At some point, it seems like it'd be up my alley. And this will definitely whet my appetite playing this. I like these console close in, the board is all visible. Like I don't love the fog of war stuff in XCOM. I think it works really well for the tone of that series. I think it helps establish that tone. You don't know where they are. You're kind of fanning out and trying to find them. It works great for all of that. But in terms of the tactics, I just hate that it takes so long, to get to the tactical part,
Yeah, that's so hilarious in this game to watch the AI do their turns because they show all the menus.
They do everything. Yeah,
it's like I can't really watch that. I can't read. Why are you doing it this way? But I guess it's that's we won't talk about it this time. But as we play this game, I definitely want to ask you plenty of questions about the engine and sort of like I don't know. It's just again because I'm a PC tactical combat person, the translation, because this is basically menus the game in a lot of ways, right? It's because your only option is because you don't have the mouse is like menu diving and stuff, and so it's really kind of fascinating to see how they're building a game, technically around that. But I'm looking at the site for just sort of the genre. And some that I didn't realize I've heard the names of, but didn't realize maybe were in this is like Front Mission, Shining Force, Vandal Heart.
I did know. Okay.
I've heard of Vandal Hearts. That's an older around the same era. So yeah, there were more of these than I realized as far as the era. And those were just on the eastern side.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was a big thing at one time, and I think, it felt like something that kind of disappeared, but I think it just really, just kind of became a niche thing that not a lot of people
like RTS
wasn't a big mass market thing. Yeah, so
Disgaea is on here too. Yeah, for 6th generation for PS2.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that's one someday maybe.
Oh, Valkyria Chronicles, I forgot about. That's supposed to be good. That was always well spoken about.
So, let's talk about. I mean, you've played 2 Final Fantasies now, or you're almost done finishing one of them. But you've played a lot of 2 Final Fantasies. What do you think of when you think of Final Fantasy, and what are your thoughts about how it translates to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I actually have been surprised at how Final Fantasy it feels to me, to be honest, because people are going to yell at me for saying this, but there's a lot of menus in Final Fantasy as well.
Well, yeah, especially in this era. I mean, you have to remember when this game came out, the controller on the PlayStation didn't have sticks.
Yeah,
that's how old this game is. So, and it came from a lineage, obviously, with the SNES, where you had similar kind of limitations, right? So, just
and I think if you're making an RPG of any kind, whether it's JRPG or otherwise, that has any sort of depth on a console, you're gonna have to have menus. It's kind of unavoidable, right? Like if you go to something eventually like Mass Effect or something, that becomes more of an action RPG in a lot of ways, right? But anyway, I think the structure of it and how clever they are at using the isometric maps to I don't know if they're isometric. I guess they're not technically.
Yeah, they are.
I don't know. Are they?
Yeah.
Isometric maps,
broadly speaking,
to tell some of the story, and I think because I have enough of an understanding of the franchise. I mean, I have no idea what's going on in the story. There's a lot of proper nouns being thrown.
Yeah, it's proper nouns.
And it's new. Especially. I think it's we talked about the setting and a little bit of its relation to Final Fantasy 12, but I think it's a completely new place, which is often the case, I guess, for these. And so, it's kind of like, so there's that, but the aesthetics of it feel very, I mean, it's got a very like Catholic kind of Catholicism thing going. I don't know. There's a lot of religion being talked about and stuff.
It's a medieval setting, which is not always true of Final Fantasy. Right. So I want to say the first one is the original Final Fantasy. I played that, but it's a whatever SNES
that's
title
like
or something
8-bit.
like that. So it's very or even maybe an 8-bit. So it's very difficult actually to read that way. It's probably there, and I just like playing it. Besides I think on a GBA, it kind of like I think all of that stuff went over my head. I was like, wow, this is way more D&D than I expected, but I'm not sure that the medieval stuff was necessarily there. Yeah, especially playing 6 and 9, you would look at this and be like, huh, this is weird. Normally it's not it's not a this kind of setting. It's normally its own kind of mix of
right
science fiction and magic and whatever, and this is more, at least setting wise and history wise, it's definitely reflecting power struggles in medieval Europe kind of feel, for sure.
Wait. I'm just reading a thing here that says the Ivalice of Final Fantasy XII is considered a Japanese take on the Star Wars galaxy. Okay, I'm in. Ivalice. Anyway, yeah. So, but I guess the sort of like comforting thing to answer your question on sort of some of my initial reactions, like having terms that I already know from playing the other two games and having things like jobs, things like potions and Phoenix Down and
all the potions,
and structure of like, the same sort of equipment sort of design roughly and all those sorts of things. You have a party, right? And you're using them. So, and to be honest, like,
and you'll probably balance your leveling and things like that. And
yeah. And I love, little things like leveling mid mission and stuff like that. But I have one theory that I'll say here in the first episode, and we'll see if it ends up being true by the end. But I think I've said this on the 9 and the 6 podcast. The combat in Final Fantasy games for our JRPGs is never really my favorite part. And I have a feeling I'm going to like it a lot more in this game because it is so focused around like giving a good structure, not a good structure. I don't want to qualify it, but giving a specific type of structure to combat. And because I'm an XCOM fan, I feel like there might be a good merger of, each tile has a meaning. I'm making the positional choices myself by moving who I want. There's even like which way they're facing is important.
Yep.
It seems like, and so that's sort of the tactical aspect of it. I feel like I often miss playing the other games. So
yeah, especially in the RPGs where there is no meaning to space, right? I mean, it's
abstract.
It could literally be, a web page, right? I mean, it doesn't have like in terms of what's going on. You could just be clicking the thing you want to do. Right?
Well,
I mean, in terms of the simulation, it's like
I'm kidding.
The character comes up and I input what it does, and then things play, but there's no input there. Rarely. Yeah. I mean, occasionally there's like, action. And you've got what's his name with the where you have to do the inputs and things like that. So there are, on the margins, Sabin, on the margins, there's stuff, but in general, it's like, you have a very abstracted kind of universe. Later games, certainly the more modern PS3, PS4 titles have had more real-time elements, and so they have had they've had a lot more of that has,
and that's
more engagement in the I think like there are parts of 13 that you might really, really like. 12 for that matter. I think you might like the hunt stuff because they're typically pretty involved battles, but yeah, they've back in this era for sure, it was select from nested menus the thing you want to do, which is like your attack, your magic, your special, if you've got some like your thief class or whatever you're going to steal, and then items, like, and those are your things, and maybe run away or something like that. But we never run. We are warriors.
Well, to maybe overthink it here a little bit and give them a lot of credit, which you would assume they greenlit this project for very good reasons. I think it's a really interesting and good and clever, well thought through idea to make a if Tactics Ogre or the Ogre games or whatever were popular in and of themselves, and Sakaguchi or whomever loved them. I do think Final Fantasy is going to translate well to that genre for me. And so it's kind of like a nice peanut butter and chocolate moment, right? Where it's like, well, what would you're talking to the ogres guys and folks, and you're like, well, what would you do if you had the Final Fantasy franchise? Make one of those. And it's like, it kind of, it's perfect.
I'd sell more units is what I did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's like Star Wars in that way. So I'm sure that the ogres team was really excited to get that opportunity, because I do think it's a good marriage of the two so far, at least.
Cool. I was wondering too what you thought about the sort of the beginning of the game. It reminded me a little bit of Final Fantasy VI. I mean, it wasn't in engine, but it was like it was 3D movies kind of setting up what's going on in the world. It felt very like a lot of establishing shots, like, oh, these chocobos are racing to get to with their riders to get to the to this church, which then you see in the scenes. We'll talk about that sort of cutscene approach, which I also think is amazingly charming. Kind of after, but did that kind of, I mean, it almost, this was kind of the era where Square was starting to do more of that with, both Final Fantasy VII and of course 8, to a much greater degree in terms of the sort of image quality and things like that for the movies, for the cinematics. This is when they had really kind of could switch to be very cinematic driven, which was part of the reason why they moved to the PlayStation in the first place, right? Is more memory. We can tell stories in this way. Was it overwhelming? And there were a lot of quick cuts. I'm just curious how it landed with you.
Yeah, it was nice. I mean, I think I'm a little bit biased on that stuff, because I have always been one of the proponents of trying to align any story content you have as closely as you can to the game content. And even back then, even from the beginning. So if you can do your story content, I won't say cutscene, but I'll just generalize it. If you can do it in the engine that you are going to be using, playing the game mostly, and then I'm more of a fan of that. So it's not that I zone out on those opening cinematics, but I also know, like you said, Square specifically, and I would actually put Blizzard in this camp too. Blizzard's a bit too notorious, I think, at this, because they've both of them have hit such a high bar on CG movies.
Yeah.
To the degree where they started a studio to make CG movies that ended up failing, Square did, that it becomes like a whole nother effort, and it's like, yeah, sure, you're good at making CG movies, but I'm not here for the CG movie,
right? Yeah.
So even though I, as a lore nerd, for instance, with the Blizzard ones, I do like them because they further that stuff forward. But anyway, that was a bit of a soapbox, but it did get me in the mood for sure. But I think I was really more ready to get into the game, to be honest.
Yeah,
and that's where, to your point on the charm of once you do get into the game and they do start, the equivalent in 6 is like you have two characters talking and they just have the 2D tiles, right? Where it's like, oh, you're just watching these tiles come back and forth in their portraits. But here, they're doing it in the same engine you're going to be fighting in, and it's awesome.
They're turning the camera around. They're doing all the things they can do. They're clipping the back-facing planes and things like that. So that's like they're in an interior, but of course you can't see it because the polygons are only drawn on one side. So they get back-face culled, I guess is the technical term. And then you're seeing the sprites down there, and I'm looking at it. My download for this was like, I want to say 200 megabytes or something like that, and so I don't think there's a lot more movies in our future. The opening cinematic. I mean, it's obviously that's compressed, and so probably, but the movies were already pretty compressed. I have to say, watching it, I was like, oh wow, there's some, as I mentioned, some image quality issues with some of these early ones where they're still working out, streaming formats, from the CD. There were no standards for streaming video, right? Every studio was writing their own and trying to figure it out. And, some standards body somewhere was trying to figure out how to do, high quality streaming video, at the time. It wasn't really to the PlayStation 2 that we had a pretty solid standard that everybody was using, that basically was coming from Sony, I think, at that point. I may be wrong. Maybe it might have been just the implementation, but there's definitely at this time, it's like, oh, wow, we have all this space. What are we going to put in there? It's 660 megabytes or so on a CD of that time. And it's like, wow, we can do movies. It's like, well, how do we do that? And the architecture is really good. Sony's architectures have always been really, really good for getting data off the media really quickly. Not as good as a cart, but about as good as you could do. They've always been pretty good about it. They've architected around it to have good throughput from the disk. So you could do that. Like, you could almost stream directly from the disk, but this was still it's 1997. Very few people even have the internet. You're not streaming video on the internet then either on a 14.4 modem or whatever. So it's definitely a lot of technical innovation to be done around what's in a lot of games these days. You play a modern game on the PS5. I mentioned Ghost of Tsushima in previous weeks. Horizon Zero Dawn, same way. I don't know how many of them are in engine versus pre-rendered. I know in Ghost some of them are pre-rendered, or it seems to me anyway. Might not be. It might be just. No, I think it probably is. But anyway, whether it is or not, the point is that to stream those high quality videos in is not an easy thing, especially when you had to kind of compress them and decompress them on the fly with this kind of low end processor. But we've incorporated that kind of storytelling into sort of the AAA space for good or ill at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of the pre-rendered stuff on this, at least, where they had text. There were times when I was having, because of the resolution, I was having hard time reading.
The letter text. T is really bad. I looked at a letter T for just like several moments of just like, what is that? What is that? Yeah. And so I looked for another word that I had already, because it was that thing where it's like, the first and last letters are the most important letters for us when we read.
Okay.
I didn't know so that's a thing. This has been, there was some study done, and you can actually mix up the inner letters. And as long as the first and the last letter are still correct, we can read almost as quickly as we could read if they were correct.
Whoa.
So our brains basically take so much from the first letter and the last letter, and then the rest is kind of like, well, and those other letters are there.
Wow.
And when I saw the T, it was at the end of a word. And I'm like, I'm not sure what this word says. And I went and found a T that was not at the beginning or end of a word. And I was like, oh, that's a T.
Wow.
It was very funny. It's like my brain was, it was a very strange thing. Yeah, I remember reading that and being blown away by like, whoa. And then they had example text. And I was like, wow, you really can just read it. If you stare at it, you're like, oh, that's totally wrong. But you can just read it. It's so strange. Brains. How do they? Yeah. Anyway, so
amazing.
So my thinking on that was like, I much prefer, as you mentioned, the sort of charm of the SNES RPGs, the 16-bit RPGs, where you're getting a lot out of the sprites and the sort of level of abstraction, and it ages better. Like seeing the in-engine stuff. It's like, oh, this all. Like the pixel management is there, something we talk about often of like, that the density is right. It looks correct. We talked about it with God of War in particular, that it worked at scale. Everything was kind of looked at the right resolution, despite whatever scale it was. And the same thing is true, when you're in that interior environment. Sure, the environments are maybe a little blotchier, but in general, it just holds up. It's like, it's consistent. It's the oddness of the weird places where there isn't detail in the pre-rendered stuff that is so jarring.
Yeah, well, and I've been thinking back, just because ironically I'm playing 6 right now. I feel like I comment often when there is a story moment that they're using the actual in-game sprites to do. They take control away from you and they're animating them, and they have, it's consistent, it's charming, they're often really well done. I still,
they get tons of mileage.
We talked about it, when we played the game. I talk about it on stream ad nauseum, but it's just they're at the top of their game when they're making 6, and I don't need pre-rendered cinematics. I have everything I need in those game, in the rest of the game. And so, I'm glad that they found, from a cost perspective, production cost perspective, they had to find a solution, because you can't just have every cutscene in this era be, pre-rendered one. But I'm glad that they found their solution for this game, because they have this 3D polygonal world. They have the sprites already, right? And there's some custom sprites, like, I don't know if you got to it yet, but there's the scene where the father dies, or is in
Spoilers.
bed. Sorry, yeah. Which you're not even going to remember whose father it is or whatever. But it's obviously a custom sprite for that scene, so they do some, because you're not going to ever be controlling an old man in a bed around, right? So it's a one-off.
Probably not. No spoilers there.
Though that would be cool. The old man in the bed on the battlefield. Can you imagine? I don't know what it. Yeah, I want to.
It would be a scene where it's like it's the funeral and you're trying to move it to the gravesite, but you're being waylaid by samurai.
You're going to do dash or throw rocks, throw stone at it to push it around. But yeah, we'll get to that later too. Space economy in the game, I think, is pretty interesting. But anyway, so I just love. I think the church scene that the game starts with is a perfect example that they nailed it. Where you're just like, it feels, it's like it's I wrote the note down, diorama. There's been a great, few diorama based modern indie games, right, that really embrace it. I guess you could say Paper Mario as well. But it just feels like a toy box or something, like these they feel like cool little toys that you're getting to interact with.
Sure. Like The Sims, which also has a similar viewpoint.
Yeah, isometric. Yeah.
I was also going to mention, because we touched on it in pre-show and just want to toss in the through line, is that Vagrant Story, which is also set apparently in this world.
If you say so.
Yeah, that was news to me. I did not know that. But I will say there's a real commonality with the approach to the cutscenes, in that at the beginning of the game, you're watching some scene-setting cutscenes that are an isometric view, and then because you can do this, and you could do it in this game as well if they wanted to, they might, in fact, I don't recall. There's a point during the opening credits while it's playing these multiple scenes, which, like I said, it's a very similar kind of view. It's all polygonal, it's all 3D in that game. But there's a point at which it's like, oh, and now you take control of the character. Because cool. It's just running in the engine, it's like just seamlessly, like, oh, now you're in a fight at the beginning of the game, establishing what's going on, and this one's, could, like I said, it could do that because it's rendering just how it renders the battles.
Well, Metal Gear Solid, right? Like,
sure, yeah.
That's probably the best example for PS1, in my opinion,
yeah.
of the perfect merger of the two, feeling cinematic, but also being able to have those smooth transitions.
Yeah. No, I would tend to agree with you as far as preferring it to be, delivered in the same manner, as the rest of the play. I also prefer that, but I do remember things like this in Vagrant Story being a little mind blowing in that way of like, oh, they're just telling the story, probably not. They were mind blowing for me, I should say, because I wasn't expecting that, and you can see a big difference between, the early Final Fantasies and Final Fantasy IX, which has pre-rendered cutscenes, which are really quite good. They still have aged, But they looked really, really great at the time. Like I said, Final Fantasy VIII, I feel like, was the big step forward in the series as far as that goes. But anyway, enough about all the cutscenes.
A lot of players do see them as rewards, though, right? So I
Sure.
don't, I mean, it's just a taste thing, but they are important to the structure of, especially story based.
What you're saying is there's too much sugar in that for you, and
yeah, exactly.
I was going to say not enough meat, but that doesn't really work for you. Yeah, but that's just me. All right, so I guess let's get a little bit into the the presentation aspects of the play. I mean, we've already mentioned that it's sprites on a 3D isometric battlefield that you can view from 4 perspectives, I believe, right? You can basically turn it in 4 directions. Because whenever you face somebody, you have 4 options, right? And if you had more, then you would have to be able to see in more directions, I believe, for that to make sense to the player. So yeah, you have this very limited, and a fairly limited play space. I mean, you're talking, whatever, they're generally, 8 by 8 or something like that. So you can pretty readily count up the number of polygons it needs to be if they're all triangles. So that's like 128 tries plus some verticals. Not a complex field. They're textured and everything. So that's, but to bear in mind that it's like, it's one strip of triangles that we draw basically for the environment. Some other stuff, some water effects and things like that change it a little bit, but for the most part it's blam. Here we've got our terrain renderer. It's height based. In fact, the height information is in some of the presentation information. You can see what level, quote unquote, the character's on, which is what level vertically that they're on. And you can spin that around to see what's going on. And it's really important to be able to do that because you want to, sometimes you can like preview, okay, what would, if my player did this move, that has a range, where could they hit? Before I move, I need to know where they're going to be able to hit. So it's really important to be able to see the space in that way. The only alternative, I think, at that point would be to be like, make it mostly flat and have no obstructions, and that would be a lot less visually interesting. So this is pretty cool.
Yeah, I feel like the first time that I hit the bumpers to rotate the camera was a little bit like the homeworld moment we talked about, right? Of, that first revelation where you're like, oh my gosh, I can move the camera, Yeah. And I think some of it is my bias towards games like XCOM and having that be my upbringing in this genre, which, most of the time, a lot of the time, especially in the old days, was not really an option. It was isometric, but you weren't usually rotating the camera all the way around. And so I think you mean it. Yeah, it's an excellent point about the scope of it, the scale of it being more confined and closer in, because it, it's like the chess analogy is good versus the, I don't know, Axis and Allies, being XCOM or something, or something where it's just like a lot more is going on, a lot more,
or even complexity. Just to have more space than you can take in easily, right? With Fog of War in particular is the thing.
Yeah.
I find it hard to plan against Fog of War, right? But again, totally makes sense for the game.
This is a different, it's a different thing. Yeah. But I loved, rotating the camera around was a revelation for sure. And then the other thing I want to pull on more is the elevation side, because, obviously you don't really get that in the Final Fantasy games, and elevation can often, in this era for tactical games, be something that people strive for. But, in XCOM, it ends up being a little clumsy, and finicky. And then again, like you said, the sightlines and Fog of War come into play sometimes too with that, because, they have the different levels basically, and you're on the map, you can scroll through them or whatever.
Right.
But here, they have a jump ability, right? So in the second battle in the town, you can go down into the water and you're like lower, and you can
Yes.
kind of run through the water. You can get on the roof. Like, in fact, one of the enemies starts on the roof in the beginning of that battle.
Calling you out, the thieves.
Yeah, so it's like these other elements that they've added in, which I assume the Ogre games had, or something like it, or maybe not. Maybe there were some innovations in this game that they started to have in there. So I've been really appreciating the sort of that little extra added depth in there, because you really use 3-dimensional space much more so, and you do need to really rotate the camera sometimes to get a good vantage point.
Yeah, to understand what's going on, to really to see the battle. Yeah, I like it from that perspective. I also, it makes me think. I'll have to look and I'll have to read the manual because I didn't get a chance to do that today. But it makes me wonder, like, is that important? To tactical choices. Does elevation mean firing your arrows further or whatever? Like, does it matter to have the high ground?
Yeah, that's a good point. I assumed
maybe
it did.
not.
Yeah, it may not. It may not.
Well, my assumption also is that it does, but it, regardless of whether it does, it feels like it does, right? So, just naively here at the beginning of the game, for us, it does, right? We'll find out if that turns out to be true. I really don't remember. I feel like it does, but I really.
Well, I know that some characters have different jump amounts of their ability, jump ability, and some. So it's like if there's places you can't, like there's not a ramp or stairs or something, then, getting somebody up there, they would have to have a certain ability to jump to that.
Oh,
height.
right.
So it's like if
maybe
it's 3 tiles up or something.
Somebody. Yeah, right. Sure.
Yeah. So there could be maps that take it. There haven't been so far, but there could be maps that take advantage of that. Because I think in all the other, in the 3 that I've played so far, there's always a way to get anywhere you need to.
Right. Yeah, and it gives you a lot of options, as a combat designer, to make it more interesting environments, than you would get in a more flat space, right? With games like XCOM, you get all the mileage from the changing environment, in the sense of like, oh, these are fields and there's obstacles and things like that I can hide behind. That's where you kind of get all your visual differentiation. Here it's literally map to map. It could be pretty different, with all that elevation and being able to do simple models and things like that as well. So that's another thing that I think, that, keeping it small, but still big enough to vary things makes it interesting. So,
yeah, that's true. They can put depth in different ways when they do it that way. Yeah, because they have a smaller space. We won't. I think you haven't gotten to the 3rd mission yet, but I think there's stuff to talk about there right away too when we do get there. So maybe next time. Okay. There's some choice stuff that I didn't anticipate having. Basically, I guess it's like a decision tree kind of thing, which is really interesting. And that map is like more of an open field. It still has elevation, but it's also very contrasting to the town, the one before it. So It's really, and then there's also kind of like an objective that you have, depending on what you choose, that actually caused me to fail. So I actually had to play that one 3 times.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So,
that's one of the things I had in my list. Was like, I didn't remember to what degree this varied. But the structure is basically, for any fight, it's the first thing is like, what are your conditions for winning? Oh, well, prior to that, actually, it's who are you taking in with you, and what are their starting positions, which, we can maybe come back to. I don't love, because you can't actually see the field.
and the thing is I'm not sure it even, I don't know. The time that I was meticulous with where I put people, when I got into the map, it didn't look like it was the correct. So I'm not really sure. Yeah, maybe it was, and it just was like the angle of the camera was misleading me. But
it feels strange. Yeah,
I don't know.
So they do.
Yeah, but you're right. You don't know. You don't know.
Yeah, but you don't know what you're facing. So it's like that decision feels. I mean, it's. If you fail, I guess you can try to use that information. I do remember doing that in the past of like, oh, I definitely want to have these characters here and these characters here. I didn't know that the enemy was going to be over here or whatever, and you sort of learn that after you've played it and failed and been like, oh, well, if you had told me that all the enemies were coming from this side of the map, I wouldn't have put all my support characters there, or whatever. So there's that. And then the next thing is that they'll give you sort of the conditions for victory, which for the first two battles, just kill everybody, kill all enemies. That's your,
Yep.
And they do that a lot, but it sounds like in that third mission, they're already.
Yeah, they give you a choice. You get to choose your condition of success. Yeah. So, although I don't know if you don't take everyone out. I did the objective, and then I also took everyone out, but I wonder, I guess that one is implied in the other. So I won't spoil it, but okay. So it'll be interesting to talk about there. And then next time too, I'll read the manual on this, but the other, I'll make the assumption now that may be wrong, and we'll clarify as we go, but it seems like that they are, with the job system, they're splitting up certain aspects of the sort of traditional Final Fantasy abilities or actions that you can do into different character jobs, if that makes sense. So for instance, the chemist, at least for me so far, the chemist is the only one that brings potions in.
Right.
Not everyone can, like, in Final Fantasy VI,
anybody can use
can use a potion, right, on anyone else. But I actually like the idea of splitting some of those common abilities or actions that you can do to the different people in your squad. So it's like, oh, my chemist is the only one who can use potions, so I need to take that tactically into account, versus like everybody has a potion and everybody can do,
right.
You know what I mean? Like there's I assume that's going to become more and more important over time, because they're intentionally, which is good for a tactical game, not letting every character do everything. You really have to pick your battles. So that's, I think, going to be exciting.
Yeah, no, I think that is really cool, and the job system is pretty deep and interesting, is my recollection. We'll talk a lot about that for sure as we go, because you're going to be making decisions about when do you want to fork somebody off. We'll definitely need to read the manual before next week, so that we're prepared. I'll say we, because I don't remember well enough to be prepared now. And I do think a lot of this information is available in the game. It's just a lot more terse, and naturally, the sort of existing help system.
They have a written tutorial in the game that you can go through.
Correct.
But I didn't finish it.
Yeah. Well, let's I guess we'll put a pin in it there. Of course, the next thing in the structure, I guess, is that you fight. So we didn't get to that part, but it seemed obvious. I might as well close the loop. And then you win or lose, as it turns out. I guess you can save on the world map in between any battle, so you always have the opportunity to go back or to start from your previous save. I guess you get an end game when you die.
You do, yeah.
And you have to go back to the main menu and say continue or load game or whatever it is. Yeah.
When Ramza dies, then you lose. And then this one had another objective that you can also lose through. And then it's the good old fashioned game over, and then you go back to the title screen. It's like, oh crap.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So
I don't know why we did that for so long as an industry. It was such a thing.
So funny.
I just literally can't justify why you would do that. I mean, like, I have no idea. On the PS1, as we've talked about before, you're running different executables for all of those things. They were called overlays, but it's basically you're pulling in different parts of the game code from the disk as you go.
Mm-hmm.
Not the case, obviously, in anything that's been remade, but at the time, when you only had two megs of memory for both instructions and data, I think it's my recollection of the PS1. You had to find ways to fit a lot of things into that space, which is another reason why everything's so menu based. Is it's a very simple system that you can easily do. It's not complicated. And it's an
interesting question, though. I wonder if it's, because we live in an age of wanting to keep people in the ecosystem and in the game and playing the game. So, know, if you lose, it's like, how do you get them back in the game as quickly as possible?
Right.
But, in that era, it's like, well, they already bought the disc. And if they game over, maybe they just want to stop playing.
Yeah.
And they don't want to just reload. I don't know. It's just like a different mentality because it's not as much about there's no ecosystem. It's just you have the disc and you're playing it.
Well, and of course, it was also way closer to the arcade era, right? Where all games ended, right? Every game had an end screen. And most players saw the end screen pretty quickly, right? Because that was the business model. And a lot of that stuff, I think, is a bit of a hangover from that as well. And we also weren't thinking in the more like keep them engaged so that they don't bring it back and trade it in.
Secondhand wasn't a thing yet either. So
yeah, not really, not to the degree that it became. All right, well, we will return to this next week and play a bunch more of it. We're kind of gonna put it out there now. It is unlikely that we will finish this game in the next 4 weeks. With 3 weeks to go, just because. And who knows if we'll do 4 weeks or not, but just because it's an over 40-hour game, and we both have a lot of constraints on our time right now, so it might be tricky for us to manage it. I finished it before. The story is, of course, a big part of why you play a Final Fantasy game, and so we may miss out on that and not be able to discuss stuff towards the end. But I think we will have explored most of the mechanics and jobs and things like that over the course of the next few weeks. So just setting some expectations there, because when Tim told me how long to beat on this one was 43 hours or whatever it was, I went, huh? Because I didn't remember that for sure. And that's probably a streamlined,
that's the minimum, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Woof. So it's probably would be considerably longer. I mean, you've already blown your perfect play. You've lost the mission twice.
I've lost twice. Yeah.
So you're in trouble. Anyway, we had no email this week. We'd love to get your email at devgameclub@gmail.com or your reviews through the Apple infrastructure or whatever podcast platform you use. We think we're a 5-star cast, but if you do write us a review, we'd love to hear it. Send us mail, let us know where to find it. We'd love to read those on the show as well. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com, on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram at devgameclub, and you can find my fellow host twitching at twitch.tv/
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end,
where, as we have mentioned, you are playing Final Fantasy VI. I don't know if you played last week. We also recorded on Tuesday, so I don't think you played last week.
No, I didn't play last week, but I am going to play right after this. So
nice.
There will be one. Yeah, there will be one tonight.
There will be one. People can watch the VOD if they're listening to this when it comes out.
Yes.
But, most weeks he tries to get to it. Let's see. We also have a fan Discord. You can check that out. There's a link in the show notes. That's run by the fans. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo, the Discord, merch store, all by Mark Garcia, with some help from others. Have fun engraving memories into your swords this week, and good night.
Good night.